crisis to advance that.
Right. I think Gordy Feldman, I think you're next up.
Gordy, you've got to unmute.
Okay, hear me now?
Yes, it's wonderful to see you, Gordy.
I haven't seen you for a long time, Joe. It's really nice to connect again. I came in late because I was at another meeting for an hour. So maybe you covered this, but it seems to me, and drawing on your, and by now common awareness, that if the United States were facing Russia in Canada and Mexico, we'd be not very happy about it. Is there any movement underway to simply dissolve NATO? It seems to me there's no reason for NATO to exist. It was there to fend off the Soviet Union, which it turned out had no plans to invade Western Europe anyway. It just seems to me the United States is playing the heavy-handed usual role, which doesn't vary between Republican and Democratic presidents. And I mean, is there a movement, active movement to dissolve NATO? It seems to me that would be a major step forward.
There is a movement, principally in Europe, not here. So again, just to recall, I quoted the first Secretary General of the of NATO, who was British, actually a British lord, who said, you know, the purpose of NATO was to keep Germany down, Russia out, and the U.S. in. And so it's been a vehicle for U.S. control and domination of Europe, you know, throughout the Cold War. And then, as you're saying, you know, at the end of the Cold War, it wasn't retired, but rather expanded. And now, you know, it's a major source of U.S. Global and imperial power. So again, I did refer to NATO's new 2030 strategy. You know, it's reducing its commitments to out of area global South interventions. And has made China as well as Russia, containing them, one of its two priorities. So you do have, and people can look it up on the web, there's a formation in Europe called No to War, No to NATO. It began at the time of the Strasbourg NATO summit, and they've held conferences and demonstrations every time NATO holds a summit. NATO will be holding its next summit in Madrid in June, and there's cooperation now between this European-wide movement and really quite massive forces in Spain who will be protesting there. We have a long way to go, and you know, one of the interesting contradictions in all of this, as I mentioned, is the drive for a creation of a more advanced European military. And the U.S. has sort of been trying to ride two horses, not necessarily easily. So while it's encouraged the buildup of European military forces and increased the European military spending, it's had the fear that as they go forward, you may find that they have less need to rely on the United States and therefore weaken it. But again, if you go back just for the, I guess not quite for the fun of it, but Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was the national security advisor to Carter, and you know, long a major force in creating U.S. foreign and military policy, he wrote a primer for his students when he's no longer in office, I think called the Grand Chessboard, and he went back to kind of classical geopolitics, basically saying that, you know, whoever controls Eurasia, the heartland of Eurasia, is the world's dominant power. And what he was saying there was that for the United States to remain the world's dominant power, it has to have toeholds on three on the periphery of Eurasia, we being an island power. So NATO has served that function in the West. Our bases and alliances in the Arab world, North Africa on the south, and then, you know, Japan and our military alliances in East Asia, and now with India. So we have to understand that the United States is a global empire. That's not what they teach us in school. maybe you did when you were teaching school, but we have to work for reducing the dangers of war, working for real freedom in this context.
Joe, let me just add that there's something to me unbearably audacious and outrageous about the United States position on Ukraine. We live in a country that overthrew democratically elected governments in Iran and Chile and Greece and a dozen Latin American countries. The idea that we care about democratically elected governments or democracy, even at home, where we have at best a pseudo-democracy, is just outrageous. If I were anywhere in the rest of the world, I would be looking much more angrily and rejectingly at the United States and at Russia at this point.
Yeah, I mean, many people around the world see it just as clearly as you do, and you know, at some point, you know, the curtain is pulled off the Wizard of Oz, and that's going to have huge ramifications here in the United States when that happens.
Yeah, thanks.
So Ellen, you had a question? Yeah.
I do. So Joe, the takeaway from your presentation is that it is extremely unlikely that Russia is going to invade Ukraine, period, except for a possible accident or a miscalculation. And maybe it's my naivete, but could you describe what those possibilities might look like? I mean, what would be a miscalculation or an accident?
Well, I think the biggest danger that we face is guys with guns along the border with Donbass, you know, it could be one of the right-wing forces within the Ukrainian military that thinks, well, this Friday night's a good time to kind of begin retaking the Donbass. Or on the other hand, it could be a frightened Eastern Ukrainian soldier or Russian on the border who is frightened and sends off a rocket. And on a Friday night, no one's going to know, you know, who started it. And you know, we still have debates over who started the Georgian-Russian war in 2008. And while I'm saying it's unlikely, it seems to me unlikely that the Russians would invade. You know, I think I can't say that with 100% certainty, right? But it seems unlikely. We do have negotiations moving forward. And I found it really, it's interesting. You know, I can't say much about this track 2 discussion that I've been in. I mean, I sort of, you know, it's sort of like Sesame Street when they had the routine about which one of these things is different from the others. I mean, here I am with former government officials, government advisors, and others from all sides, the U.S., Russia, and Europe. And they're talking about a range of diplomatic possibilities, ones I put on that screen. And then, you know, Michael McFaul was the U.S. ambassador to Russia, a very hardliner, a guy who has no love for Russia at all. And here he is writing today in Foreign Affairs, basically saying, as much as we don't like Putin, we should be willing to move to grand bargain negotiations with Russia. And the agenda that he lays out is almost precisely the same as the one that I gave you at the end of my talk. So my understanding is that, you know, some of the people in the meetings I'm with, they're talking to other people. I'm aware that there are other track 2 discussions going on. So you know, with Putin's statement was yesterday, the day before, in terms of being willing to continue negotiations. And as I said in my talk, you know, signaling among governments is always interesting. You know, Biden, it'd be difficult for Biden to climb down from the really bellicose rhetoric and mobilization that he's been building. So yesterday, if you watched his speech, he was talking about the willingness to engage in negotiations, and then he switched from there to kind of hardline language. As I said in the talk, I think that hardline language was principally to cover his tracks, to give him cover as he encourages the possibility of more negotiations. I could be proved entirely wrong, but I don't think so.
Okay, Bill Haas has his hand up there, but almost. And then there's two questions in the chat. So I'm gonna, Bill, you wanna speak?
Yes, I just wanted to thank Joe for this excellent presentation. He outlined the history very well and all the different dimensions of this problem. The one thing that I think we don't want to forget about are the people that lived in these former countries of the Warsaw Pact that were dominated by the Soviet Union, had no freedom, could not travel. You know, it was just not the best existence. So I think when we do these negotiations, we have to consider their views, their feelings. What do they want? That they joined NATO, many of them, to avoid this kind of situation. And I do think there's not a moral equivalence between Russia and the United States. All you have to do is see the number of people that want to immigrate to different countries. They don't want to go to Russia. They don't want to go to China. They want to come here, as imperfect as we are. And a number of people have expressed the fact that we made some major foreign policy blunders in the past, in Chile, in Iran, other places. There's no question about it. But I think it's a mistake to say this is a question of moral equivalence. And I just wanted to get your views on how we consider the views of the people, the citizens of those countries, in these larger macro negotiations between these power blocks. Because I think that's true. The world runs on power blocks to a certain extent, but it also needs to take into account the views of the people concerned, the people in Ukraine. And I think Joe alluded to a couple of options there that would do that, but I think we don't want to lose sight of that. And I was wondering if you could comment on that.
Okay, so you know, on the question of moral equivalence, I don't think I was arguing for that. You know, I think, you know, what can I say? I mean, I indicated that I think that Putin is a tyrant.
Yeah.
But you know, we are in very real danger of having a tyrant return, right? I mean, with what Trump did in his rule and the efforts to overturn democracy, I think we have to appreciate that you know, we're not pure as driven snow. So one doesn't have to have moral equivalency to be trying to find a common security approach. I mean, we've got to build back from the danger of annihilation. The other piece I didn't really talk about very much is the confrontations, the new Cold Wars between the United States and Russia, the United States and China, is making cooperation to stanch climate change almost impossible. And so, you know, at one very deep level, what's most important is for the great powers and others to be less fighting over respective power and how to stanch climate change. I mean, the parts of the tundra are now in Russia are now burning, so it's that bad. You know, in terms of well, first of all, in terms of Ukraine and the people of Ukraine, what I was trying to communicate was that I think it's quite possible for a neutral Ukraine, one of which is federated, which would allow for Russian speakers and Russian Orthodox who feel themselves increasingly up against the wall to be able to have their culture and autonomy. In fact, the government of Ukraine committed to move in this direction in the Minsk agreements, and it hasn't fulfilled them. One of Russia's biggest arguments and sources of anger is that the Ukrainian government hasn't fulfilled its part of the Minsk agreements. course, Russia hasn't done 100% either. So I think that's possible. And I think there were ways other than full NATO membership to negotiate security for Eastern European countries, and I would agree. I mean, the repression, and I've made reference in my talk to the Soviet Union maintaining, in order to maintain its buffer zone, really brutal satellite governments, right? I mean, we're both old enough to remember 1956 when the Russians came into Hungary. They did in 53 in Poland. Not nice. So clearly, in comprehensive negotiations, I mean, if you have the OSCE, and maybe that will be the forum for those negotiations, you have all the European governments present. And clearly it shouldn't be done, can't be done over their heads. So just one last thing to say, it was interesting in the run-up to the U.S. invasion of Iraq, I believe it was, our conservative leaders were talking about using New Europe, which is to say our Eastern European allies, against old Europe to leverage their support for the war. And we're now in, again, the if you will, hypocritical situation of saying we're committed to democracy when Hungary and Poland are anti-democratic states, where the basic freedoms that we say we want to uphold in other countries, well, not quite as bad as Saudi Arabia, another ally, but there you are.
There you are, right? Okay.
Thank you. There's a couple of questions. Oh, Peter, I'm going to just take a question or two from the chat, only because Dennis Wong has put one in here, and then we'll come to you, Peter. What are your thoughts on the international law that rules against invasions and the intervention in the affairs of sovereign states?
Yeah, I mean, that's the UN Charter. It's supposed to be the law of the land here in the United States. And as I said before, I do believe that Russia violated both the UN Charter and the Bucharest Agreement when it covertly helped to invade, helped to break off the eastern Ukraine from the large part of the country. And its seizure of Crimea, the reality is that there's no way that Russia was going to let Crimea go. It's been its Black Sea port and home for its Black Sea fleet forever. We have to kind of work around that, but they didn't do it in a kosher way. Of course, the United States has violated this time and time again, and I think we have to do all we can to ensure the rights of people to their own self-determination, and clearly aggression is an absolute violation of anything we can support.
Peter, go to it.
Yes, thank you, Joe, for a terrific presentation. My question has to do with Nord Stream. I know that Chancellor Scholz has not signed on to it, but how big a leverage point would that be in this standoff? How much suffering, pain for Germany versus how much suffering, pain in Russia with loss of income? Is there a net suffering ratio there? Could you comment on that?
Yeah. So, in the moment, the Nord Stream pipeline isn't impacting energy in Germany or in the rest of Europe. What's happened is that the Russians have reduced the flow of gas to those countries as part of its leverage in these negotiations. It's not a nice thing to do, to say the least. And what you see is that the United States, even Japan, are mobilizing all they can to provide alternative sources of energy to not only relieve suffering that may follow in Europe, especially in Western Europe, but also to reduce Russian leverage. It's interesting. You go back to Willy Brandt and in the height of the Cold War, and Brandt is one of the most noble figures that I think we've had. He had to flee Germany during the Hitler period because of his resistance, and when he did a tremendous amount for not only trying to break through the Cold War, but also in terms of North-South equality and justice. And the policies that he pursued, his Ostpolitik, were looking to try to engage Eastern Europe and Russia. Germany's interests are a bit different than those of the United States. It has long sought markets in Eastern Europe and in Russia. And part of the quid pro quo here has been Russia with, at this point, its almost only resource is oil and gas. So there's a kind of complementarity between their economies. So the other piece here is that the Russians are looking to reduce vulnerability of the pipelines to Western Europe that flow through Ukraine, and can serve as a lever against to limit Russian influence. It's interesting. I mean, I think geopolitically, the concern of the United States and not a few in Europe has been that with Nord Stream, Germany and Western Europe will become that much more dependent on Russian natural gas, and that in turn would also limit or kind of reduce its orientation toward the United States. The Russians, one of the things that's been raised is that if Nord Stream 2 is canceled, that this is going to bring Russia to its knees, and that's not at all true. One of the things that's happened has been the the last year or so, the tremendous increase in the price of oil. Russia, Saudi Arabia have been profiting from that tremendously, as have the oil companies. So Russia has built up, after having been the government having so few resources, it now has a huge rainy day fund, which could help see it through for some time to come. And in terms of percentages of Russian gross national product and income, Nord Stream 2 will only be a small part of it at this juncture. So as I think Lawrence Wilkerson, Colin Powell's former chief of staff, said, it's basically small change for the Russians. But geopolitically, it could have huge impact over the coming decades.
Hey, I'm gonna, it's 25 after 8, so there's one question in the chat, and I'd like to ask a question, and then maybe we can turn it back over to Sue Ellen to close us out. This question is from Ann Frisch. How much are parties taking consideration of the 15 nuclear reactors and the Chernobyl nuclear waste?
I don't know. They certainly aren't talking about it publicly. But we have these reactors, and if it comes to war, those reactors will be highly vulnerable, right? We should remember Chernobyl, right? It would be just a mind-boggling disaster if one of those nuclear reactors are hit. If there's a meltdown, be a disaster for Ukraine, be a disaster for Europe. So, what do you want to say? I mean, there was just the madness of pursuing nuclear power, and it just underlines one more level in which we're, this danger is just one more level of of what we can face with nuclear power.
I just have one question, and then we're going to turn it over to Sue Ellen. And I know this is a hard question, Joe, but if you had to pick 2 or 3 arguments that we should be using in our discussions with our elected officials about why they should not be supporting any future troop movements or any future movement of US or NATO troops, what would we be saying to Markey and to Warren and to our representative, Catherine Clark?
Well, I think the first thing is you don't pour oil on a fire. We're in a very dangerous situation, and any escalation, leads to increased fears on the other side, and that increases the possibility of miscalculations. So I would say that. The second is I would encourage them to use all of their political influence to move Biden, perhaps in language different from mine, to close that open door to NATO membership. I mean, that's been the most aggravating element in this crisis. For Russians to have fear that, and not only membership in NATO, but also the possibility of the U.S. deploying its own weapons and troops in Ukraine, independent of NATO. That's just going to ratchet up the tensions. And I guess the last two, I mean, I would encourage them to read Michael McFaul's article, right? I mean, McFaul is no friend of Russia. And yet here he is calling for the same negotiations that I outlined and which have been discussed in track 2 conversations. So the possibility of the agenda for what can be done to ratchet this down, it's all there. It's all been spelled out. And rather than pour more oil on the fire, let's get behind the agenda that's already been identified.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much, Joe. I'm going to turn this over to Sue Ellen.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you all for being here and coming up with some excellent comments and questions. And there's a lot to chew on. And Joe, you gave us a lot of background, going way back further than even I had thought about myself in terms of history.
Let's go back to 988.
Yeah, exactly. So thank you very, very much for that. So in these last few minutes, just if people have any announcements that they wish to make about the upcoming events or things you think the group would like to know about, now's the time to do that. Anyone have any announcements?
I can say that on March the 2nd, my organization has organized a webinar, which will include Alexei Gromyko, who I quoted earlier, Tara Kronberg, who's Finnish and with the Stockholm International Institute for Peace Research, I mean the CIPRI, and Daryl Kimball from the Arms Control Association. And that will be focusing on diplomatic paths to resolution of this. So it'll take it out of the sky, beyond the sky from Watertown into these higher reaches of international discourse.
I put the link to that event in the chat early on today, and there is a request for someone to give us can we have the reference to the Foreign Affairs article? Where might people, Joe, can they just Google Foreign Affairs, or what should they do?
It came to me. Let me see if while we're talking, I'll see if I can find it in my email, and I'll just post the post the link. Give me a minute here, because I'm slow. But go ahead with other things. I'll post it.
Any other announcements?
What time is the webinar?
It's early. It's 8 o'clock. I believe it's 8 o'clock in the morning. No, it's at 10. I'm sorry, it's 10 o'clock.
Thank you.
And that link is where exactly?
I'm looking for it.
Oh.
Oh, that one, Tony did.
Tony, you said you posted it much earlier?
Yeah, I did. I don't see it now, but I posted it way back
post-
when we began.
Give me a minute. Give me a minute. I'll post it. Here we'll go to the McFall. And I'll get the other one. Give me a minute.
Did you put the McFall in there, Joe?
It just went in.
Yeah, so people want to go to the chat. The article Joe was referencing in Foreign Affairs is in the chat.
And Frisch is also posted, as people may see, the IPPNW.org No War a briefing on the nuclear reactors.
I'll just, again, if anybody is interested in a exploratory discussion about a potential peace and common security working group with Watertown citizens, please just email me. Joe, did you get your event? Yes, Joe's event is now posted. March 2nd webinar is in the chat also.
Great, excellent. So on that note, we'll all keep our fingers crossed, try to write to our legislators along the lines of the strategies that have been discussed. And again, thank you all for being here.
And Joe, thank you very, very much.
Joe, it was
Thank you
great.
for this opportunity. It was a delight to see a number of friends on this call, and I just, there's so many side conversations I wanted to have. But thank you for this this opportunity, and on we go together.
There we go. Thank you all. Bye for now.
Good night.
Yes, thank you very much.